I do want to begin by welcoming our witnesses, and I look forward to their testimony, their firsthand recollections of this watershed event of 1989, the policy recommendations that you have for Congress that we should consider. I think today's anniversary will remind us that the fundamental human yearning for dignity and human rights and basic rights is not limited to any one region or limited to one country or limited to one culture. These aspirations have transcended geography and culture throughout the history of man. Today we honor the lives that were irrevocably altered by the events of that day, those who perished, those who were imprisoned and tortured, those who lost mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, and those whose loved ones remain missing and unaccounted for. Tiananmen must not be viewed exclusively through the lens of history. Rather, today we must also reckon with the ongoing systematic human rights abuses committed by the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government against its own people. And we must reckon with the emerging and new geopolitical competition between tyranny and liberty, between democracy and totalitarianism. To reflect briefly on the events that led up to that fateful day, in the spring of 1989, thousands of students gathered at the center of Beijing to mourn the death of a prominent reformer within the Communist Party who wanted to move China towards a more open and democratic political system. And in the days that followed, thousands would gather in Tiananmen Square to call for greater freedoms and political reforms and to protest the repressive policies. Their numbers grew as the days passed, not only in Beijing, but also in 400 cities and universities across the nation, until more than 1 million people, that included journalists and workers, government employees and police, joined the students and echoed their demands. And then late in the evening of the 3rd of June and into the 4th, China's People's Liberation Army, acting on the orders of the Chinese Communist Party, responded with brute force and lethal violence, opening fire on peaceful demonstrators. To this day, the precise number of resulting casualties is unknown. There has been no public accounting of the events of that week, and there has been, of course, no justice for the victims. Rather, those that seek to commemorate the event or seek information about those killed, like the Tiananmen mothers, are harassed, they are detained, they are arrested. Perhaps the most iconic image associated with the Tiananmen massacre is Tank Man, the small, solitary figure with shopping bags in hand who stood in the path of an advancing line of tanks. Tank Man remains an enigma. We don't know his fate. Some believe he was imprisoned, others believe he was executed. There are some who still hope that he's alive today. We don't know. But while the names of many of the Tiananmen protesters are now lost to history, and to the Chinese government's Orwellian memory hole, the bravery of protesters in the face of certain danger reminds us that the principles of freedom, democracy, and self-rule are not just American principles. They are human principles that neither tank treads, nor torture, nor terror can erase, not even by the Communist Party of China. Principles that I believe still remain the quiet hope and aspiration of many people in that ancient and noble nation. The U.S., the nations of the free world, should demand that the Chinese government allow open discussion on the events of that day and the enforced amnesia of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, online, at Confucius Institutes here in the United States that operate on our college campuses and globally as well. Unconditionally release those detained or imprisoned for attempting to commemorate the anniversary, and reckon publicly with the horrific violence experienced by the Chinese people at the hands of the party and the military. And we must continue to use opportunities like this, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for calling this hearing, because we must continue to use opportunities like this to speak about the true story of the Tiananmen Square massacre. This point is important because Tiananmen revealed to the world the true nature of the Communist Party in China. For decades, successive U.S. administrations tried to pursue constructive engagement. The bipartisan conventional wisdom wrongly assumed that trade, investment, and other engagement would eventually persuade Beijing to embrace and accept liberty and respect for human rights, and that optimism was misplaced. Today we see an increasingly aggressive Chinese Communist government that is more repressive in domestic policies, more mercantilist in trade and economic policy, increasingly dismissive of all international norms, and more assertive in exporting their authoritarian model globally. While Chinese government-sponsored repression looks much different today than it did 30 years ago, the goal remains exactly the same: to preserve the Communist Party monopoly on domestic political power through state-sponsored indoctrination, through mass surveillance, through arbitrary detention, torture, violence. The Communist Party today in China is using technology to stay in power, whether in the emerging social credit systems or the vast digital surveillance states and accompanying internment camps, to transform the religious and ethnic identities of millions of Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. Data-driven surveillance facilitated by iris and body scanners, voice pattern analyzers, DNA sequencers, and facial recognition cameras in neighborhoods, on roads, in train stations. Technology, by the way, that they export into other countries. Sounds like science fiction, but it's happening. In the era of high-tech social control, there is a direct line of repression linking the tank man and the internment of over 1 million Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities in what they call political re-education camps. And just over the weekend, Twitter, a global company that isn't even allowed to operate in China, suspended the accounts of reportedly more than 100 Chinese language users critical of the government, coincidentally just ahead of this anniversary. We must also keep American companies accountable for their potential complicity in Chinese government censorship and other abuses. And so I hope that the time has come for the U.S. to once again lead, along with the rest of the free world, in holding the Chinese government accountable for its ongoing blatant repression of the Chinese people. We must stand with the oppressed Tibetan Buddhist monk, the silenced human rights lawyer, the imprisoned Christian pastor, the disappeared Uyghur Muslim, the disillusioned Hong Kong democracy activist, and countless others living under the repressive policies of the Chinese government. To do anything else dishonors the spirit of Tiananmen. It tarnishes the memory of those lost and places us on the wrong side of history. Thank you.